All right, you guys, let's take all of our retouching knowledge that we've learned and let's tie it all together and let's put it into something called an action. What is an action? Well, in Photoshop, something you can do is record an action. And what that means is that if you have certain things that you do to every photo, you can record an action. Basically, you can record those things and just press play and let Photoshop do all those things for you. This works really well anytime you're doing something that's repeatable. And what I mean by that is, for example, in our photo, the very first thing we did is, remember, we made a new layer and we renamed that to small blemishes. That's going to work for every photo, no matter what. We could always just let Photoshop do that for us. What you couldn't do with an action is if you're like, well, part of my style as a photographer is that I like to come in and put a white X right on the tip of somebody's nose, right? That wouldn't work because the nose is always in different spots and it's always in different places and it's different sizes. So that's not something we would want to do for recording an action. But if it's just simple stuff like creating new layers and stuff like that, then it's pretty easy to record an action. So let's do this. Let's create an action that gets us a lot of our layers. It's not going to be able to do everything for us, but it's going to definitely save us some time. So I'm going to come up here to my top of my screen here in Photoshop, and I'm going to go to Window, and I'm going to choose Actions to bring up my Actions panel. It's actually hanging out right here. It's this one that looks like a play button right there. And now let's come over here to our Layers panel before we get started in the Actions panel, and we're going to delete all of our layers. All of our hard work on our retouching guy is going to have to go. So I'm going to click on my very top layer, hold down Shift, and click on this small blemishes layer, basically selecting all of the layers except for the background layer. And then I'm just going to drag these down to the garbage can. Goodbye, layers. Now, before we start on our action, let's create a new set. Basically, we're going to create a folder that's basically like saying, hey, these are my actions, not Photoshop's actions, because these ones right here, these are all there by default, except for a few of these, which I made a while ago. So in my Actions panel, I'm going to come up here to the top, right here in this corner on this little menu button. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to choose New Set. And this would be a good chance for you to give it a name. You can call it My Actions. You give it whatever name you want. Does not really matter. Go ahead and hit OK there. And look, now we've got a folder for all of our actions. And then we're going to create a new action. So we're going to click on this plus sign right here. And we're going to give this a name. So let's call this Retouching. And we want this to go into the set My Actions. If you use an action a lot, you can actually assign a function key to it. So you could say, hey, when I press F4, I want you to run this action. Now, there are some times where F4 will already be tied to something. So maybe you could do Shift F4 or Command F4. And so you could set that right there. And then you can even give your action a color so that it stands out on the Actions panel a little bit more. So here's what you need to know, you guys. Once I press record, Photoshop's going to start recording everything I do. So you don't really want to make an action until it's something that you're pretty comfortable with. So let's give this a try and see how it goes. So I'm going to go ahead and hit record. And there you go. So it's basically saying, hey, something's already has the F4 command. That's okay. I'm going to just ignore that. And here we go. So remember, when we were retouching, the very first thing we did was make a new blank layer. So let's do that right now. And you'll notice it's being recorded right now. Everything we do, not like the moving of the mouse, but anytime I click something, it's being recorded. So I'm going to click on this plus sign right here to create a new blank layer. You can see, look at that, it recorded make layer. And then we're going to rename this, right? So I'm going to double click here and I'm going to call this small blemishes. This is the layer that we removed all the blemishes with on using the healing brush tool. So there you go. We've just automated those first two steps for us. But remember, we also had to make all of those adjustment layers to do the teeth and the eyes. Let's make an action out of all that. And we can do that before we even start working on our retouching. So let's do that real quick. If you remember, right, the very first one we made was for whitening the teeth. So I'm going to click on this right here. I'm going to choose Hue Saturation. And I'm going to change this to yellow. And I'm going to desaturate and lighten. And that's it. And then I'm just going to press Command I to invert my layer mask. And we're not going to do any of the actual adjusting yet. We're just creating that adjustment layer. And let's rename this so we know what it is. So we'll double click on that. And we're going to call this is the whitened teeth layer. You'll notice all of this stuff is still being recorded. Then we made another adjustment layer. We did curves on this one. And the whole point of this one was to just lighten up the eyes a little bit. So we just clicked right here in the middle and dragged up right about there. Then we did Command I to invert the layer. Let's rename this Lighten Eyes so we know what it's for. Then we did another one, another Hue Saturation. This one we just cranked up the general saturation and Command I to invert it, and then we'll rename this to saturate the eyes. So we tried to make the eyes more colorful. Then we made another hue saturation adjustment layer. And this was for people who have a lot of red in their eyes. So we came into the master, changed that to reds, and desaturated the reds. All right, and then remember we painted that out of the eye. So let's Command I that to invert that. And we'll call this remove red from eyes. And then we did one more weird curves adjustment layer. So we'll come up here and do curves. And remember, this is where we made the dark parts of the eye darker. So we brought this down here like that. And remember, I don't mind doing too much. I don't mind overdoing it because I can always fix that with the opacity. So it's always better, I think, to add a little bit too much. And then we just put this line back where it was so that it was pretty straight as far as up here goes. And we just had that little dip right there. Then we Command I that. And that's it, you guys. We could automate all of that. So let's go ahead and press stop on our recorded action. And look at all of these steps that we just recorded. We just did all of these nice little things. So Photoshop should do all of this for us. So let's test it out. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to click on this top one, hold down Shift and click on this one, delete all of those. And ready, here we go. I'm going to come up here to my retouching action, and I'm just going to press play, or I could press F4. Ready, here we go. Whoa, look at that. Photoshop did all of that for us. Now, we still have to go in on the small blemishes layer and grab our healing brush tool, right? And start removing these spots. And we still have to go through each one of these layers one by one and manually whiten up the teeth. Right, like that. But at least all of that work of creating all the layers, Photoshop did all of that for us. And that's a huge time saver. Very, very cool. We obviously can't build an action for the liquefy because that's going to be different. And we can't build an action for removing the bags under the eyes. That's all going to be different. So we're not going to build actions for that. But that last step we did, the skin softening, we can absolutely build an action for that. So let's do that. What we need to do is we need to create the two layers as if we were going to be doing our actual retouching. So I'm going to grab my healing brush tool, and I'm just going to fix a couple of these real quick. Just do a couple of fixes right there because I need there to be something on this layer here first. Then I'm going to press Command Shift Option E. And that's going to duplicate those or mash those two layers together and create a new layer. And we're going to rename this one Large Blemishes. All right, and then we would go in and fix the bags under the eye and do all that stuff. And then we're going to duplicate this layer, Command J. And you'll notice we're not actually doing these things. We just want these layers to be here so we can build the next action. So let's rename this one right here to Liquefy and press Enter there. And there you go. Now we're ready to start building the action. Now here's the situation, you guys. We're going to create a new action here. And the very first step of that new action is going to be to duplicate the layer. The problem is that if we have, for example, if we're not paying attention and we have this layer selected when we start the action, that's going to duplicate this layer and try to run the action based on this layer. So that's not going to work. So we could record as part of our action to select this layer. The problem with that is that this layer is named Liquefy, and if Photoshop doesn't see a layer called Liquefy, it won't know to select it. So you just need to make sure, however you choose to do it, maybe you're going to make sure that you have this layer selected, and then you're going to press play, and it's going to run based on what layer is selected. Or maybe you're going to record in your action to select the Liquefy layer. If that's the case, you need to also make sure before you start the action that this layer is called Liquefy. All right, so let's do this. Let's click off of the Liquefy layer. You'll see why in just a second. So click on any layer other than the Liquefy layer. I'm going to click on Create a New Action here. And we're going to call this one Skin Soften. And hit Record. And I want it to record me selecting the Liquefy layer. So I'm going to click on it right now. You can see it's Select Layer Liquefy. So you just have to make sure, like I said before, that you rename this layer to Liquefy before you run this action. And then what we do is Command J to duplicate it, right? Then we rename this to Skin Soften. And it's okay if you misspell it like I did. Then it's just a fun little thing for you to do. And then we're going to invert it by pressing Command I. Then we're going to come up and change our blend mode from normal to vivid light. Then we're going to come up here and go to filter, other and choose high pass. And here's where we run into a problem, because remember we talked about when we made this, when we did this the first time, that we're going to use a different number for every time we do this. So I'm going to choose the number that's going to work best for me for this one, and then I'm going to show you how you can solve that problem in future action. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK on that. And then I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And remember, this number is also going to be different based on the photo that we're using. And I'm going to show you what to do about that. So go ahead and press OK there. And we'll select that. And then remember, we need to add a layer mask. We need to invert that layer mask, Command I. And then we can even record selecting the brush tool. But I was already on the brush tool. So I'm going to choose a different tool. You can see it's set that. And I'm going to change back to the brush tool by pressing B on my keyboard. And I also want my foreground color to be white. So I'm going to press D on my keyboard. That's going to reset that to white. And then I'll go ahead and press stop. And this just recorded a really cool action for us. It's going to do our skin softening for us. And now, again, all we'd have to do is start with our brush tool, set to white, make it big and soft, and start painting in the softness, right? Very cool. Now, how do we get it so that it allows us to make some input on these two things? Because remember, on the high pass filter and the Gaussian blur filter, we need to change that depending on the photo we're using. Well, what I'm going to do is come in here and see these little empty boxes right here. I'm going to check those right there. And what that's going to do is, let me delete this layer. And I'm going to come up and I'm going to play this now. So I'll click here on Skin Soften and press play. Photoshop's going to do that work for me, except for it's going to stop there and wait for some input from me. So depending on what image I'm using, I could change that to a different number. And then it's press OK. And it'll stop on Gaussian blur and say, all right, we need some input from you again. So I'll maybe do that and then press OK, and then it's going to finish. So that's a really nice thing. You can tell Photoshop, hey, I want you to stop on these two things and allow me to give you some input before you move on. So there you go, guys. We just made two actions. Let me show you what this would all look like if we start all the way over. I'm going to delete everything. Come up here and go to Retouching and press play. Photoshop's going to do its thing. We'd come in and we'd make all our adjustments here. We need to come in here on this small blemishes layer, remember, and remove all our blemishes that we want to get rid of. At which point, making sure we have this small blemishes layer selected, let's press Command, Shift, Option, E. And that's going to mash those two layers together and make them their own layer. Then we're going to rename this and call that large blemishes. We really could have turned that into an action as well if we wanted to. Just those two steps. That's up to you. At which point we'd go in and we'd remove any large blemishes like bags under the eyes. Then we would need to duplicate this layer again. So Command J, rename this to liquefy. We'd do our liquefying, right, and clean that up and do anything we need to do there. At which point we are now ready to click on our Skin Soften action and press play. That's it, you guys. We just automated a huge part of this retouching process.